You feel it, even if you can't fully explain it. That quiet sense that somewhere, behind screens and invisible systems, you are being measured in ways you never agreed to. Not like school grades, not like human judgment, but something far more silent and precise. Something always watching patterns instead of faces. A large company has already formed an opinion about you, and according to their data, you are labeled as very intelligent. But nothing about this is what you would expect. It has nothing to do with degrees, IQ tests, or achievements people usually associate with intelligence. In fact, the reasons are so ordinary that most people would never believe they matter at all. Just two behaviors. That's what it takes. Two subtle patterns in the way you interact with the world that quietly define how a system interprets your mind. And the strange part is that you've been doing them your entire life without realizing they were being observed, recorded, and transformed into a profile that follows you everywhere you go online. Every pause, every decision, every moment you thought was meaningless becomes data. But here's the question that changes everything. If a system can decide you are very intelligent without ever speaking to you, then what exactly is it measuring? Your thoughts, your instincts, or something deeper you don't even fully control? Because once you discover what those two things actually are, you may never look at your own behavior the same way again, and not everyone is ready for that. Modern intelligence is no longer defined only by what you know, but by what you do without thinking. Somewhere between your daily habits, your digital movements, and your split-second decisions, a silent system is constantly building a version of you, one that is not based on personality, but on patterns. Most people imagine intelligence as something tested in classrooms or proven through achievements. But in reality, a different definition is already being used in the background. One that doesn't ask you questions, but observes you in silence. Large-scale systems, especially those driven by artificial intelligence, don't rely on human judgment anymore. They rely on behavior tracking. Every interaction you have online becomes a signal. What you click, how long you hesitate, what you ignore, what you return to, and even what you almost choose but don't. Individually, these actions seem meaningless, but when combined over time, they form something powerful, a behavioral map of your mind. And this is where things begin to shift. Because intelligence, in this framework, is no longer just about knowledge. It is about pattern consistency, adaptability, and predictive behavior. The system doesn't care what you claim about yourself. It cares what your actions repeatedly reveal. In other words, it doesn't listen to your identity. It builds it. This is how a new form of classification quietly emerges. Not based on personality tests or interviews, but on statistical behavior modeling. You are not asked if you are intelligent. You are measured as if you already are, or are not. And what's even more interesting is that this redefinition is not presented to you directly. You are not told, "We are analyzing your intelligence." Instead, you experience its effects indirectly. Personalized feeds, targeted recommendations, filtered information, and predictive suggestions that often feel strangely accurate. Over time, this creates an illusion. The illusion that the system understands you better than you understand yourself. But in reality, it is not understanding, it is calculating. It is identifying patterns that repeat, behaviors that stabilize, and decisions that follow probability instead of randomness. And slowly, without notice, intelligence becomes something external. Something measured from the outside in, rather than defined from the inside out. This shift is subtle, but it is fundamental. Because once intelligence is defined through behavior tracking, the question is no longer, how smart are you, but rather, how predictable are you? The entire system narrows everything down to something surprisingly simple. After analyzing millions of behavioral patterns across users, devices, and environments, a consistent conclusion begins to emerge. Not about personality, not about education, but about two specific signals that appear again and again in people labeled as highly intelligent. Two things. And once you hear them, you realize how invisible they are in everyday life. The first one is decision efficiency under uncertainty. In simple terms, it's how quickly and accurately you make choices when you don't have complete information. Not when everything is clear, not when you are guided, but when things are ambiguous, incomplete, or even misleading. The system observes how you respond when there is no perfect answer available. Do you freeze? Do you delay? Or do you adapt and move forward anyway? Because intelligence, from a behavioral perspective, is not measured in perfect conditions. It is measured in incomplete ones. And this is where most people misunderstand themselves. They think intelligence is about knowing more. But in reality, it is about navigating uncertainty without collapsing into hesitation. Every time you scroll, choose, abandon, or commit, you are revealing how your mind handles incomplete information. And over time, these micro-decisions form a pattern that the system interprets as cognitive strength or weakness. But that is only the first layer. The second thing is pattern adaptability. This is where it becomes even more subtle. Pattern. Adaptability is the ability to change your behavior when the environment shifts without being explicitly told to change. It is not about intelligence in the traditional sense. It is about how quickly your mind updates itself when reality no longer matches expectation. When something new appears, do you cling to old habits? Or do you adjust without resistance? Every digital environment is built around this principle. Algorithms constantly test how you respond to change. New layouts, new recommendations, new content flows, new stimuli. And your response is never neutral. It always reveals something about how flexible your thinking is. Together, these two things create a profile that feels almost invisible, but extremely powerful. How you decide under uncertainty, and how you adapt when patterns break. And the system doesn't need to ask you anything to measure them. It simply watches. But here is where the idea becomes uncomfortable, because neither of these two traits feels like intelligence in the traditional sense. They feel like habits, like instincts, like things you would never think to define yourself by. Yet in this model, they become the foundation of how intelligence is assigned, which leads to a strange contradiction. People believe intelligence is stable, something you possess. But in this framework, intelligence is fluid. It is reconstructed every time you make a choice, every time you adapt, every time you hesitate or move forward. And that means the label very intelligent is not a fixed identity. It is a temporary conclusion based on how your behavior aligns with these two signals at a given time. Decision efficiency under uncertainty. Pattern adaptability under change. Two invisible measurements, constantly updating. Always watching how you move through uncertainty without ever needing to ask who you are. What makes this idea even more unsettling is how ordinary the data behind it actually is. There is no dramatic surveillance scene, no visible observer, no one actively judging you in real time. Instead, everything is built from fragments, tiny actions you perform every day without thinking twice. A pause before clicking, a moment of hesitation on a post, a video you abandon after 5 seconds, a search you start but never finish. On their own, none of these actions mean anything. But in large-scale systems, nothing exists on its own. Everything becomes part of a sequence, a pattern, a probability trail that reveals how your mind tends to behave when no one is watching you directly. This is where data collection becomes less about information and more about interpretation. Because the system is not just recording what you do, it is learning how you behave across time. It connects moments that feel unrelated to you, but are statistically meaningful when seen from above. It doesn't just see you clicked this video. It sees you tend to explore certain types of content when emotionally curious, or you abandon complex information when cognitive load increases. You are no longer a person in the system. You are a pattern in motion. And that pattern is built from repetition. The more you interact, the clearer the structure becomes. Over time, the system begins to notice stability in your choices. For example, some users consistently choose faster decisions even when slower ones might be more accurate. Others repeatedly return to familiar content instead of exploring new options. Some users hesitate before acting, while others act before fully understanding. None of these behaviors are labeled as good or bad at first. They are simply observed. But observation is not passive, it is cumulative. It builds a model of your cognitive style. And this is where intelligence classification quietly begins to take shape. Because once enough data is collected, the system starts grouping behaviors into categories. Not emotional categories, but functional ones. It identifies how you process uncertainty, how you respond to complexity, and how you adjust when conditions change. For example, if a user consistently makes stable decisions even when information is incomplete, the system begins to associate that behavior with higher predictive reliability. If another user frequently changes direction when new data appears, that is interpreted as high adaptability. If a user struggles to decide under uncertainty, that becomes another measurable pattern. None of this requires human interpretation. It happens automatically, through continuous feedback loops. Every click trains the system. Every hesitation refines the model. Every choice updates the prediction of who you are likely to be in the next moment. And the most important part is this: the system does not need to understand why you behave the way you do. It only needs to recognize how consistently you behave in similar conditions. That is why intelligence, in this framework, becomes statistical rather than emotional. It is not about what you feel or believe. It is about what you repeatedly do when conditions are not perfect. Even your mistakes become data points. Even your confusion becomes a signal. Even your randomness becomes part of a pattern. And over time, the system begins to build something that feels almost like a mirror. But it is not reflecting your thoughts. It is reflecting your tendencies. A version of you made entirely of behavioral probability. This is why two people living completely different lives can still be compared by the same invisible metric. Not because they are similar, but because their decision patterns can be reduced into comparable structures. And once that happens, intelligence stops being an abstract idea. It becomes something engineered from observation, not declared, not tested, but inferred continuously from the smallest actions repeated over time. What most people never realize is that once intelligence becomes a system of patterns, it also becomes fragmented. It is no longer a single idea that you either have or don't have. Instead, it splits into different layers, each one measuring a different aspect of human behavior. Some systems focus on speed, how quickly you respond to information. Others focus on stability, how consistent your decisions are over time. Others focus on adaptability, how easily you change when new patterns appear. And others focus on complexity tolerance, how well you handle situations that don't have clear answers. None of these are traditional definitions of intelligence, but together they begin to form a model that looks more like a behavioral map than a psychological trait. And this is where a major misconception begins to form. People assume intelligence is a fixed internal quality, something stored inside the mind like a resource. But in behavioral systems, intelligence is not stored. It is expressed. It appears through interaction, through repetition, through response under pressure, which means something uncomfortable becomes true. Intelligence is not something you are, but something you consistently demonstrate in specific conditions. However, even this system has limitations, because no matter how advanced behavioral tracking becomes, it still cannot access meaning. It cannot understand intention. It cannot feel motivation. It cannot interpret emotional context beyond statistical correlation. It sees what you do, but it does not truly know why you do it. This creates a gap between human experience and system interpretation. For example, hesitation might be read as uncertainty in one context, but in reality, it could be reflection, caution, or emotional weight. A sudden change in behavior might be labeled as inconsistency, when in reality it could be growth or learning. A lack of engagement might be interpreted as low cognitive interest, when it could simply be fatigue, distraction, or emotional overload. The system does not distinguish between these internal realities. It only sees patterns that repeat. And this is where misclassification becomes possible. Because when intelligence is defined purely through behavior, it can ignore the invisible dimensions of human life. The emotional, spiritual, and situational layers that shape decision-making are flattened into data points. This leads to a dangerous simplification, the belief that human intelligence can be fully captured through observable behavior alone. But reality is far more complex. Two individuals can produce identical behavioral patterns while having completely different internal experiences. One might be acting out of confidence, the other out of fear. One might be experimenting, the other might be struggling. Yet from the outside, the system sees only similarity. This is why intelligence classification systems are powerful, but not absolute. They are models, not truths. They describe behavior, not essence. And yet, because they are data-driven and highly consistent, people begin to trust them more than intuition. They start to believe that what is measured externally is more accurate than what is experienced internally. This is one of the biggest misconceptions of the modern age, that quantifiable behavior equals complete understanding. But even within the system itself, there is awareness of its limits. It can predict tendencies, but not meaning. It can estimate probability, but not intention. It can cluster behavior, but not understand consciousness. And this creates a strange paradox. The more precise the system becomes in observing behavior, the less it understands the depth behind it. Which means intelligence, in this framework, is always partial, always incomplete, always an approximation of something deeper that cannot be fully captured by patterns alone. And this is where the real tension lies, not in what the system sees, but in what it will never be able to see. Now take all of this out of theory and place it directly onto your own life, because this is where it stops being abstract. Every time you open your phone, every time you hesitate before clicking something, every time you choose one option over another without fully explaining why, you are not just interacting with technology. You are feeding a system that is quietly building a version of your cognitive behavior. Not your identity, your behavior profile. And over time, that profile becomes detailed enough that it starts predicting you before you even act. For example, you might notice that certain platforms always seem to know what you are about to watch next. Or that suggestions feel strangely aligned with your mood.
Or that certain choices appear easier for you than others without any clear reason.
This is not coincidence. It is pattern recognition built from repetition. The system has already observed how you behave in similar situations. It knows what you tend to pause on, what you ignore, what you return to, and what you abandon. And based on that, it begins to shape what you see next, not to control you directly, but to align with what you are statistically likely to do. This is where the impact becomes personal.
Because if intelligence is partly defined by decision efficiency and pattern adaptability, then your everyday life is constantly generating signals about how you fit into those categories. When you make fast decisions under pressure, that becomes a data point. When you delay decisions repeatedly, that becomes another. When you adapt quickly to new information, that strengthens a pattern. When you resist change or stay within familiar choices, that forms another layer.
None of these moments feel significant while they are happening. But in aggregate, they create a structure that follows you across systems. And this structure has consequences. Not in an immediate or dramatic way, but in subtle shaping. The type of information you are shown, the kind of opportunities that appear more frequently, the paths that feel natural compared to those that feel harder to access. You begin to experience a form of digital environment that is partially personalized to your cognitive tendencies. Not your desires, not your intentions, but your behavioral probability. And over time, this can create a quiet feedback loop. The system observes you, predicts your behavior, adjusts what you see, and you respond within that adjusted environment, reinforcing the same patterns again. This loop is powerful because it feels invisible. You are not being forced. You are being guided by familiarity, and familiarity often feels like choice. But here is the deeper consequence most people never consider. If a system continuously adapts to your behavior, then it is not only learning about you, it is also shaping the range of choices you are likely to make in the future. Not by limiting you directly, but by increasing the probability of certain paths over others. So your intelligence profile is not just descriptive. It becomes interactive. It influences what challenges you encounter, what information reaches you first, and even what feels intuitive versus unfamiliar. And this is where self-awareness becomes critical. Because once you understand that your smallest actions contribute to a long-term behavioral map, you start to see your daily decisions differently. Not as isolated moments, but as part of a continuous pattern being interpreted in real time. The uncomfortable truth is this: you are already being analyzed constantly, not as a person in full, but as a system of behaviors. And the real question is no longer whether this happens. It is whether you are aware of what your own patterns are revealing about you. And here is where the entire idea turns in a direction most people never expect. Because after all this talk about systems, patterns, and intelligence classification, there is a truth that quietly dismantles the certainty behind it all. These systems are not discovering intelligence. They are constructing a version of intelligence based on what they can measure, and that difference changes everything. What gets labeled as very intelligent is not a direct reading of your mind. It is a statistical interpretation of your behavior under limited conditions. It is a model built from visible actions, not invisible thought, from patterns, not purpose, from correlation, not consciousness, which means something very important. The system is not evaluating you as a whole person. It is evaluating a simplified shadow of you, one created from fragments of behavior that can be observed. And once you see that clearly, the definition of intelligence itself starts to shift. Because if intelligence is reduced to decision efficiency and pattern adaptability, then it ignores everything that cannot be easily measured. Things like emotional depth, internal struggle, creativity that doesn't follow patterns, intuition that cannot be explained, or growth that happens in silence before any behavior changes appear. These are not visible in data, but they are deeply human. And this is where the flaw appears. A system that only sees behavior will always mistake the visible for the complete. It will assume that what it cannot measure does not matter. It will treat silence as absence, hesitation as weakness, nonlinear thinking as inconsistency. But human intelligence is not always linear. Sometimes it is chaotic before it becomes clear. Sometimes it looks inefficient before it becomes meaningful. Sometimes it appears unstable while it is actually evolving. And none of that fits neatly into a behavioral model. So what happens is not that the system becomes wrong, but that it becomes incomplete while still appearing precise. This is the real twist. The more data it collects, the more confident it becomes. But confidence is not the same as truth. A model can be highly accurate within its boundaries and still completely miss what lies outside them. And human consciousness exists partially outside those boundaries. Because your internal world is not fully observable, your intentions, your silent reasoning, your emotional context, your spiritual perspective, none of these are fully captured by clicks or timing or patterns of engagement. They are experienced, not recorded, which means intelligence, as measured externally, is always a translation, a reduced version of something far more complex. And once you understand this, the label very intelligent starts to lose its finality. It becomes less of a truth and more of an interpretation, a reflection of how well your visible behavior fits a specific statistical model at a specific moment in time, not a judgment of your full capacity. And this exposes a deeper limitation in how modern systems operate. They are excellent at recognizing repetition, but not transformation. They are strong at identifying patterns that continue, but weak at understanding shifts that begin quietly before any pattern becomes visible. They can track what you do, but not what you are becoming. So intelligence, in this sense, is not fully captured. It is approximated. And that approximation can feel convincing enough to shape beliefs, systems, and even identity over time. But it remains, at its core, an interpretation of fragments, not the complete human experience. Which leads to a final realization. If intelligence can be redefined by what is measurable, then it can also be misunderstood by what is missing. And what is missing is often the most human part of all. In the end, the most important question is not whether a system can label you as intelligent. It is whether you start believing that label defines you. Because once a person begins to see themselves only through measurable patterns, something subtle begins to change. You start to reduce your own complexity into something simpler. You begin to interpret your choices as data points instead of lived experience. And slowly, without noticing, you start to view yourself the way a system would, through repetition, probability, and prediction. But you are not only a pattern. You are also interruption. You are change. You are contradiction. You are moments that do not repeat and cannot be easily predicted. And those moments matter just as much as the ones that do. The systems built around behavior are powerful because they are consistent. They do not forget. They do not get tired. They do not lose focus. They collect, compare, and refine endlessly. But consistency is not the same as completeness. A model can be stable and still incomplete. And a label can be accurate in one dimension while still missing the depth of what it describes. This is why awareness becomes so important. Not awareness of the system itself, but awareness of how easily you can begin to see yourself through it. Because once you become conscious of your own patterns, something shifts. You stop reacting automatically to how things are presented to you. You start noticing the space between impulse and action. You begin to recognize that not every decision is as random as it feels, and not every preference is as fixed as it seems. There is room inside you that is not fully mapped. And that space is where real intelligence lives in its most human form. Not as prediction, but as choice that is not entirely governed by repetition. The system may categorize behavior, but it cannot fully capture meaning. It cannot measure what it feels like to grow beyond a previous version of yourself. It cannot quantify the moment you change direction without data pointing you there. It cannot fully understand the internal shift that happens before any external evidence appears. That is where human depth exists. And perhaps the real reflection is this. Intelligence is not something that can be fully reduced to observation. It is something that expands every time you become aware of how you are being observed. Because awareness breaks automatic behavior. And in breaking it, it creates space for something new. Not just better patterns, but conscious direction. So when you hear that a system has labeled you as very intelligent, the deeper question is no longer whether it is true or false. The real question becomes, what part of you is it actually seeing, and what part of you has never been seen at all? And that is where understanding turns inward, not toward the system, but toward yourself.